Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 35 of Series 7. The question for today is, can there be a philosophical resolution of the problem of death? Now, these workshops are about human existence as subjectivity that I give focus to with the concept of consciousness. I then attempt to explicate the problems of consciousness in terms of value with a particular quality of value. In the last few weeks, we have been discussing how values are expressed in the world. These discussions have been about ethics, meaning, purpose, truth, and criteria of priority. Today, I'm discussing how death is a problem for both life and meaning or purpose. Death is a personal problem that becomes a philosophical problem for meaning. It's personal because we don't want to die, and we ask, how can life be meaningful in the face of death? It's also philosophical because we need to make sense of the world in which there is death. Like consciousness, death is also a parameter of any possible solution to the problem of human existence. Death cannot be avoided in life and must be accounted for in all serious theories of meaning. The religious problem of death, as suffering, loss, end of one's life on earth, and evil, is different. Religion typically does not accept death as the end of life or as a parameter of any solution. The problem that engages religious minds is, how can an omnipotent and benign God allow suffering and death? My answer is that God does not exist, and on that supposition the religious problem of death is resolved. Yet on the supposition that God does exist, the problem of death is resolved in life after death. But Nietzsche, Wittgenstein and others ask how life extension can resolve the problems of life. Other than material comfort, immortality only pushes the problems further back. Wittgenstein remarked that the question is not whether it is a fact, but what problems that really resolves. And Nietzsche's Eternal Return shows how immortality need not be a blessing, but the greatest horror. Yet to give context to the discussion, I will first note some other classic responses to the problem of death. 1. The denial or refusal to accept the fact of death is interesting psychologically, but not philosophically. 2. There is also the classic religious response above that I'll discuss later as offering mythological insights. 3. Medical science ranges from Emperor Qin's elixirs of life to modern cryogenic freezing of the body. And 4. Freud speaks about an ego strong enough to die, but what could this mean? I hope to say something about this later with the notion of a sufficiency of value. Some practical solutions that really work are resignation, acceptance, and a familiarity with the idea of death. Other practical resolutions are the courage and love of parents, soldiers and heroes to give up their lives. But such attitudes rely on underlying evaluative attitudes that have not yet been specified. And acceptance and familiarity may be practical answers, but they lack theoretical grounding. So these aren't adequate philosophical answers, and ultimately they aren't adequate as personal answers. Yet they are clues to what an answer might look like. That is, they indicate both cognitive and evaluative aspects of how we think and feel. In order to get round to these concepts, I will first look at several theories about death. To begin with, Lucretius' stoic and rationalist view is that death is nothing. That is, we aren't disturbed by our absence before birth, so why after death? But this isn't realistic. My future is different from my past. I invest in projects that I don't want to end, and I have hopes for the future. Death also involves other people. We grieve for others, and they grieve for us. So the Stoic view of death isn't realistic and can't offer a realistic solution. Viktor Frankl takes us from a neutral to a positive view in that death itself is what makes life meaningful. Frankl is the author of From Death Camp to Existentialism, and like Stoicism, speaks from life experience. He explains that death limits time, which gives it value and meaning, and unending time is valueless. Robert Nozick criticizes this as only one kind of structural limitation, finiteness in time. And in my view, limitation itself doesn't produce value, it only amplifies it. Yet similarly, Heidegger sees death as a full stop, a completion, a culmination that can give meaning to life. Death is, I quote, a possibility of being which Dasein itself has to take over as an authentic choice. That is, death must be accepted in anxiety as an authentic choice. But Sartre's critique of Heidegger is that death is a contingent event, so it can't be essential to meaning. In Sartre's view, I quote, death can only remove all meaning from life. Sartre speaks of the absurd character of death, that mankind is a useless passion and that life is absurd. Sartre's response is to face death authentically, to interiorize it and to claim it as one's own. But Sartre's characterization of life and death as absurd implies false expectations that are misleading. Objects like my pencil, or life, or death exist and stand out because they exist, but they aren't absurd. Thinking of life and death are absurd is produced by false expectations, such as that life is automatically imbued with meaning, or that meaning requires immortality. Yet neither of which are endorsed by Sartre or by myself. Yet there are other reasons why I find Sartre's position on meaning and death to be contradictory. One of them is because he's a non-cognitivist who employs a cognitivist theory of meaning in relation to death. A cognitivist theory determines meaning through a conception of things like an idea of the future. But Sartre states that meaning must be found in the present, yet the removal of the future by death renders life absurd. These positions on meaning in the present and the absurdity of death seem to be contradictory positions. Another criticism of Sartre is that a wider meaning of death as loss can give it philosophical significance, and a wider significance of death can be found as a metaphor for loss and human finitude. But Sartre wants to, I quote, separate radically the two usually combined ideas of death and finitude. And he does this by arguing that death cannot belong to the ontological structure of the for itself. Yet this is another way of making the obvious point that death can't be experienced within life. That is, death can be anticipated, but not experienced in itself, because it's an absence of experience. Yet the idea of death as absence offers another way of understanding and resolving the problem of death. That is, death not as the definitive problem of life, but as a form of loss that can include other problems. Yet as one problem among others, death is just one problem that must be balanced with others. That is, it's a mistake to draw the simple conclusion that death is the ultimate problem of life. And seeing the problem of death as absence can frame the problem in different ways with different solutions. These can include absence as non-being, attenuated cognition, and even finitude, despite Sartre's objections. To begin with, we have noted how Frankl and Heidegger regard death as essential to an account of meaning. Yet others, like Hegel and Sartre, regard non-being and nothingness as essential aspects of existence. And like them, I see absence, non-being and nothingness as representing aspects of consciousness. That is, consciousness, even in Sartre's view, not only brings nothingness up into the world, but nothingness is also an essential component of consciousness and value. And nothingness can be explicated by the non-existence within contrast. I often give the example of a white spot on a black board as a necessary contrast for cognition and consciousness. In the case of value, Sartre holds that choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. In both of these epistemological and evaluative cases, absence is a necessary element. Yet there's a moral sense that I could first mention in which absence is also part of a solution. That is, when attenuated cognition removes ideological baggage from self-indulgent conceptions of the self. Such absence makes way for virtues of moral fortitude, value, sufficiency and independence. I've also made this point in the cases of the indefinability of truth and absolute moral good. My point here is that there's a principle of absence at work here that can be applied to the problem of death. And it's in this way that death can also take on a wider significance in an account of meaning. That is, another aspect of death as absence is that it can be construed as the removal of one's future. And as the removal of the future, a particular theory of meaning is required to resist death. Last week we outlined the two positions of cognitivist and non-cognitivist theories of meaning. I think that this classification between cognitivist and non-cognitivist meaning is inadequate, but we can use it. Non-cognitivist theories find meaning in present experiences, but cognitivist theories find meaning in conceptions like conceptions of the future. On this account, we can immediately see why death is a problem for cognitivist theories of meaning. For example, we noted last week that David Wiggins' account of meaning doesn't even discuss death. The problem is that cognitivist accounts seek favourable outcomes in a future that is negated by death. This is a problem of cognitivism that suggests that we should look at two things. One, we should consider the significance of the future in the problem of death. Two, cognitivist limitations suggest that we should consider non-cognitivist theories. And as suggested here, and by Wiggins, those non-cognitivist theories should be in terms of value. So what we can do now is restate the problem of death in order to find an appropriate solution. We can say that death is a loss of the future and a fear of not having a future. The question then becomes, what can we find in the present that can confront an absent future? This is a huge requirement, but we can find clues in previous theories. Heidegger presents several notions of authentic choice, attitudes and states of mind in relation to death. For example, being towards death is grounded in care, and care is a particular kind of value state. It is an independence of value in the face of death he describes as unsupported by concernful solicitude. Heidegger's disdain of concernful solicitude is reinforced by his scorn for social endorsement by the they, and his view of death in unsupported solicitude endorses a certain independence of value, and this independence of value corresponds to a value sufficiency that I propose as a response to death. Heidegger need not be taken as an oracle of truth on this matter, yet his considerations can help to bring relevant concepts into focus. Heidegger has described language as metaphor and has affinity for mythology, which introduces us to mythology. I've also presented religion as a mythological phenomenology of half-hidden values and ideas. Religion expresses fundamental human problems and is a cipher of values and is a cognitive framework. And in this way, religion offers clues to approaching the problem of death. For example, Slavoj Žižek contrasts Eastern religions with the dark core of Christianity that confronts death directly. For Žižek, Christianity goes beyond detachment and indifference to engage with life's negativities. For John Haldane, scholar and advisor to the Vatican, this is even the attraction of Christianity. It speaks to mankind's ambivalence, vulnerability, and a conflicted life in an afflicted God. In this way, Christianity articulates human finitude and provides a sanctification of loss and death. Needless to say, religion provides the believer's highest value in the idea of God, and such ideas and doctrines provide further supportive cognitive frameworks. Yet Christian scripture has two different but developing views about death. Both Paul's epistles and the synoptic gospels emphasize salvation as bringing eternal life after death. For example, Paul writes that if Christ had not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and all who have died in Christ have perished. 1 Corinthians 15:14. The resolution to death here is found in its denial and in immortality. The synoptic gospels hold that Christ had to suffer and die in order to enter into his glory after his resurrection. Bishop Butler similarly speaks of the foundation of all our hopes and fears, I mean a future life. But John's Gospel unexpectedly identifies Christ's actual crucifixion and death with his exaltation and glory. God as the highest value and good incorporates death into himself, thereby sanctifies and resolves it. This is the mythology of John's and a potentially Gnostic gospel, yet it presents an interesting idea. That is, the revaluation, integration and resolution of death as part of the celebration of life. Yet this ancient mythology is clarified by a piece of modern mythology from a Star Trek story. The android Data constructs a female android companion that Starfleet orders dismantled. His companion's attitude isn't sorrow, but happiness at having the opportunity of self-consciousness. This attitude expresses several things that we can learn from. One, it expresses the wisdom of the absence of desire for a future existence that cannot be granted. Two, it celebrates the present and is an absence of regret that is sufficient to the present. These analytic and mythological investigations leave us with a number of outcomes. I want to consider three of these as features of an answer. One, the element of time. Two, the state of care as a value state. And three, the notion of absence. Firstly, on the element of time, death is a loss of the future which forces us to analyse the present. Cognitivists like John McDowell and Thomas Nagel hold that the present and the future have the same status. But non-cognitivists like Nietzsche and Sartre insist on the justification of values in the present. And both affect states and value states can only exist in the present. In the future, they are only conceptions of states. For example, I can only experience happiness in the present. Happiness in the future is only the idea of happiness. The same is the case of value states like love, hate, self-esteem and moral fortitude. Bernard Williams makes the same point about the temptation to write experiences into the world. These considerations about locating affect states and value states in the present point to a solution in the present. And in this way, death as an absent future calls for a value state that is sufficient to the task. Secondly, Heidegger's notion of care as value and meaning also introduces the idea of a value state resisting death. But what kind of value or value state in the present can deal with death as the loss of the future? My answer is already known to be a certain sufficiency of value or values sufficiency. I've previously given examples of value sufficiency, for example, self-esteem, being in love, moral fortitude, heroism, meaning and magnanimity. The idea is that sufficient value in the present is able to withstand the loss of the future in death. This isn't an esoteric idea. As noted, parents, soldiers and firefighters give their lives for others. A similar idea is found in the Gospels in the idea that perfect love casts out fear, 1 John 4:18. But John corrupts the idea by adding, for fear has to do with punishment. Thirdly, the feature of absence can be regarded as a condition of sufficient value as well as of consciousness. Paradoxically, as I said last week and at other times, sufficient value is also an insufficiency. And similarly, indefinability and attenuations of truth and morals are conducive to value. I explain these relations in my workshops on truth and the will to truth. That is, sufficiency of value also can't be just a quantity or maximization of what we want, but must entail quality. Quality of value, defined by absence, is found in such value states as morals, altruism and modesty. Relations of absence and value was found to be a principle within consciousness in the will to truth, morals and meaning. we'll now find it to be an active principle in relations between consciousness and its absence as death. Other illustrations of the relation between absence and value can be found in Nietzsche's work. He gives us such with the analogy of childhood innocence in his three metamorphoses of the spirit. The camel bears the burden of knowledge, the lion fights for freedom of truth, yet the child affirms in innocent and forgetfulness a sacred yes. The spirit now wills its own will. Nietzsche's hyperbolic style compresses so much into short phrases. The element of absence is found in the innocence of the child, which lacks resentment and antagonism. Nietzsche's notion of the spirit willing its own will also displays an absence of baggage. And now the will to power has been displaced by the will to will, interpreted by some as the will to value. Nietzsche is quintessentially a philosopher of value that implies the will to will as the will to value. And in my account, the will to value leads to a sufficiency of value that can resist death. Nietzsche makes the same point in his notion of an eternal return in the form of a parable. He speaks of himself walking along and a demon coming and whispering in his ear, what if you have to live your life over and over again with every detail repeated? Such immortality wouldn't be a wondrous salvation, but would be a terrible prospect, worse than oblivion. In order to endure, or even enjoy such a fate, one would have to be able to affirm life as it is repeatedly. That is what Nietzsche exhorts to do in his yea sayings, affirmations, and saying yes to life. The eternal return is a test of whether we have really found a justification of life. This isn't just an academic justification of right and wrong actions. It's an aesthetic or evaluative justification of all existence. These considerations lead me to the idea of a sufficiency of value as a response to the problem of death. I've explained what a sufficiency of value is, as well as how we might achieve it. That is, by an affirmation of value as the value of value, the will to value, and the pursuit of value, and that because of its preferences, the will to value tends to produce a sufficiency of value. That is, the will to value has a proclivity towards aggregating value, and denying value tends to decrease value as I have defined it. So these claims have been explained elsewhere. Yet the point here is that death can be properly understood as the absence of a future. This forces us to find a solution in the present in terms of sufficient value and meaning in the present. But cognitivist considerations of life meaning go beyond the immediate experiences of the present. They include whether the world and those I live will continue to exist after I die. So considerations of other people also go beyond the individual's immediate experience. But whether we are talking about death or other people, these issues can only be resolved in terms of the immediate values that we hold now. Whatever objective values we might suppose to be holding, they are our values that we are holding in the moment that we are holding them. Yet the question remains of how to resolve the issues of both the welfare and the death of other people. Other people are the highest centres of value and meaning that we can find in the world. And for that reason, a value-seeking agent must give special attention to other people. This question has already been given attention in my discussion of value theory ethics. Yet the significance of other people magnifies their death, both as tragic loss and as a philosophical problem. For this reason, the death of others needs to be integrated into a general account of death as loss. But the problem is that their death is not only our loss, but also their loss. There are, however, different ways in which the loss of others can be mitigated, at least for ourselves. We could consider the value of the time spent with a deceased person survives their absence. Yet having an answer to the problem of death might also alleviate the difficulty of losing them. And other people's loss of life is a real loss to them, but not one that they know about. It's in this facile but real sense that no one experiences death, which is a form of absence. Yet our own maturity and value sufficiency might also mitigate the tragedy of their absence. In conclusion, death is a difficult problem. It's a more difficult problem than I once thought it was. We are mortal. We can't attain the self-sufficiency of a god as Nietzsche proclaimed it. So do the gods look down at mortal beings in awe and wonder how we do it? Are we greater than the gods in having to cope with the finitude of time? Lucretius, Frankel's, Heidegger's, Sartre's and other accounts failed to resolve the problem of death. My considerations of time, value and absence lead me to respond to the problem with value sufficiency. That is, value sufficiency mitigates both losses in life and the total loss of life as death. And in my view, value sufficiency is a principle of life that also mitigates the problem of death. But value sufficiency isn't an uncompromising notion, untempered by life or support. Human beings aren't absolute spirits with complete value in the present with which to confront death. People need supportive ideas like religious belief, political ideals, personal support and ideologies. If the above are inadequate, a supportive framework can nevertheless be found within a theoretical explanation. It is the idea of a value sufficiency in a dialectical relation with cognitive structures, and it is driven by the principle of value seeking further value to value as the will to value. In this dialectic, value seeks independence from cognitive support, which produces further value, and this again needs support, which again seeks further value, and this is a viable purpose of life. This is the will to value and the sufficiency of value tempered by insufficiency, loss and death. Yet the principles of the will to value and value sufficiency are also the principles of life to live by. We previously noted how value sufficiency revolves problems of ethics, meaning and human relations. It's my view that the concept of the experience of value sufficiency can also resolve the problem of death. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.